Welcome to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Before we begin today's journey into a love that became a labyrinth, I have a question for every one of you listening to this right now, and I want you to be brave enough to answer in the comments. Have you ever ignored your own intuition because you were too busy falling in love with a version of someone that didn't actually exist? Have you ever felt that cold shiver down your spine telling you something was wrong, only to wrap yourself tighter in the warmth of their lies because the truth was too terrifying to face? Tonight, we explore the story of a woman who didn't just give her heart to a prisoner, she gave it to a ghost. As you listen, tell me, what was the exact moment you realized the person you loved was a complete stranger? The weight of a secret is never heavy until you are forced to hold it in your own two hands, feeling the sharp edges of a truth you never asked for. For 3 long years, my life was measured in the rhythmic ticking of a clock in a sterile waiting room, the metallic tang of industrial floor wax, and the scratch of a pen against cheap notebook paper. I had become an expert at the logistics of loving someone behind bars. I knew the dress codes, the visiting hours, and the exact tone of voice to use so the guards wouldn't look at me with pity. But everything I thought I had built, every brick of trust I had laid down, began to crumble on a Tuesday that felt like any other. I was in my apartment, preparing a small stack of books for him, a request he'd made during our last call. He had asked for a specific worn-out paperback, a story about redemption that he claimed kept his mind from rotting between those 4 concrete walls. As I picked it up, intending to check the pages for any loose debris or bookmarks as the regulations required, a single slip of yellowed paper fluttered out. It didn't fall fast. It drifted through the air like a dying leaf, landing face up on the hardwood floor between my feet. My first instinct was to simply put it back, to respect the tiny shred of privacy he had left in a world where everything was monitored. But then my eyes caught the date scrawled at the top. It was from only 2 weeks ago, a time when he told me his block was on a total communications blackout. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of my living room suddenly feeling loud, almost deafening. My heart began a slow, sickening thud against my ribs because the handwriting wasn't the neat, careful script he used when he wrote to me. It was jagged, hurried, and raw. Before my brain could tell my hands to stop, I was reaching for it. The first line hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath out of my lungs. "You don't know how much I miss what we had before she came into the picture." The word she felt like a brand. It felt like a ghost had walked into the room and breathed ice down my neck. In the story I had told myself for 3 years, there was no she. I was the only one. I was the anchor, the woman who had sacrificed her social life, her savings, and her reputation to stand by a man the rest of society had thrown away. I had spent my weekends driving hundreds of miles just to touch his hand through a glass partition. And yet, here was evidence of a life and a woman that existed in the shadows of our perfect struggle. My fingers started to shake so violently that the paper rattled in the quiet room. As I read further, the letter detailed memories I didn't share and an intimacy that sounded nothing like the reformed man I thought I knew. I sat on the floor, the book forgotten, realizing that the man I was waiting for might just be a character in a play I didn't know I was starring in. If he could lie about this, what else was buried under the floorboards of his history? People often ask how a woman like me, educated, stable, sensible, ends up falling for a man in a jumpsuit. But they never understand that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. It started through a prison outreach program, something I joined during a period of my life where I felt like I had too much to give and nowhere for it to go. I wanted to believe in the capacity for human change, in the idea that a person's worst mistake shouldn't define the rest of their existence. When his first letter arrived, it didn't look like a threat. It looked like an invitation. He didn't write like the others. There was no begging for money, no complaints about the food or the guards, and no desperate pleas for someone to save him. Instead, he wrote about the books he was reading, the way the light hit the yard in the late afternoon, and eventually he began to ask about me. He wanted to know about my dreams, the music I listened to when I was sad, and what I hoped for when I closed my eyes at night. In a world of shallow swiping and ghosting, he was the only person who truly listened. Because he had nothing but time, he gave me all of it. Our correspondence became the highlight of my existence, a secret garden we tended to through the mail. As the months bled into a year, the letters grew longer and the tone shifted from intellectual curiosity to a deep, soul-shaking intimacy. I found myself sharing things with him that I had never told my closest friends. Fears about failure, memories of my childhood, the feeling of being invisible in a crowded room. He became my confessor and my confidant. I told myself that our love was more pure because it wasn't built on physical attraction or the distractions of the outside world. It was a marriage of minds, two souls meeting in the dark. I began to romanticize the distance, seeing it as a test of my own loyalty and strength. I would stay up late into the night, rereading his words until the ink blurred, convinced that I had found a diamond in the rough, a man who had been humbled by his circumstances and was ready to be new for me. I didn't see the bars as a barrier. I saw them as a cocoon. I convinced myself that I was the only one who truly saw the real him, the man behind the inmate number. I didn't realize back then that when you're looking for light in a dark place, your mind has a funny way of inventing a sun that isn't actually there. I was so busy being his savior that I never stopped to ask why he needed saving in the first place or what he was really being saved from. The truth is a funny thing when you're in love. You don't look for it, you look for reasons to avoid it. When he finally told me why he was behind those reinforced concrete walls, he didn't do it with a confession, he did it with a performance. He sat there, his shoulders slumped, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly register that made me want to reach through the glass and pull his pain into my own body. He told me it was a robbery, a single desperate night where the world had pushed him too hard and he had finally pushed back. He painted a picture of a man at his breaking point, a wrong place, wrong time scenario involving a wrong crowd he was just trying to help. He swore to me, with those dark, liquid eyes locked onto mine, that no one had been physically hurt, that the only thing stolen was property, and the only thing broken was his own spirit. He spoke about his regret like it was a physical weight he carried in his pockets every single day, a penance he was serving long before the judge ever handed down a sentence. And I believed him. I believed him because I needed the man I loved to be a victim of circumstance, not a predator of choice. I needed to believe that his soul was still intact, just bruised by a system that didn't understand the good heart beating underneath that orange jumpsuit. I spent years defending that version of him to my friends, my family, and eventually to myself. When my sister asked how I could trust someone who had been convicted of a felony, I had my script ready. He's not his mistakes, I would say, my voice steady and rehearsed. He's a man who made a choice out of necessity, and he's paying for it every second. I became his advocate, his publicist, and his shield. I built a pedestal out of his own lies, and I decorated it with my own excuses. Every time he spoke about starting over and making things right, I saw a future where we were the heroes of a great redemption story. I didn't see the inconsistencies in his stories, the way the details of that robbery would shift slightly if I asked too many questions, or the way he would get cold and distant if I tried to talk about the police reports. I called it trauma. I told myself he was just protecting me from the darkness of his past, when in reality he was protecting his mask from the light of my scrutiny. Loving someone in prison requires a very specific, very dedicated kind of blindness. You have to learn how to see only what they want you to see, and I was a star pupil in the school of looking away. There's a specific kind of silence that exists in a prison visiting room. A heavy, humming vibration of 100 desperate conversations happening all at once, yet none of them feeling real. For me, visiting day was my Sabbath. I would wake up at 4 a.m., my heart already racing, and spend an hour picking out an outfit that followed the strict, almost humiliating regulations. No underwire, no certain colors, nothing too tight, nothing too loose. I wanted to look like the woman he remembered, but also the woman he could look forward to. The drive was 3 hours of empty highway and gas station coffee, a pilgrimage to a temple made of barbed wire and despair. By the time I reached the first security checkpoint, my nerves were frayed, but the moment I saw him walk through that heavy steel door, everything else evaporated. There was always that thick sheet of plexiglass between us, a physical manifestation of the life he had stolen from himself. But when he picked up that black plastic phone and pressed his hand against the glass, I felt a connection more intense than any physical touch I'd ever known. "Hey," he'd say, and that single word would anchor me to the spot. In those 45 minutes, the world outside, my job, my bills, my friends who thought I was losing my mind, didn't exist. It was just us, suspended in a bubble of one day and soon. Those visits were the fuel that kept my engine running for the rest of the month. I would memorize the way the light caught the stubble on his jaw, the specific way he tilted his head when he was listening to me, and the smell of the soap they gave the inmates that somehow clung to the air around him. We would talk about the mundane things, what I ate for dinner, the movie I saw, the weather, because in there, the mundane is a luxury. He would tell me he loved me in a dozen different ways without ever saying the words, and I would leave that building feeling like I was floating, despite the heavy iron gates locking behind me. I didn't realize that these visits were carefully constructed vignettes. He was curated. He had all the time in the world to prepare for our 45 minutes together, to decide which version of himself to present, which smiles to use, and which stories to tell. I was falling in love with a man who was essentially a character in a one-man show, performed once a month for an audience of one. I was addicted to the tragedy of us, to the star-crossed lovers narrative that made me feel like my life had the weight of a movie. I didn't see that the glass wasn't just there to keep him in, it was there to keep the truth out. The letter didn't just sit in my drawer, it sat in my mind, a jagged piece of glass that cut me every time I tried to breathe. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that in a place like that, people write things they don't mean just to feel a spark of life, or that maybe it was an old ghost from a decade ago that had finally surfaced. But doubt is a slow-acting poison, and once it's in your bloodstream, it changes the way you see everything. The next time I sat across from him, the plexiglass didn't feel like a tragic barrier. It felt like a shield he was using to hide his true face. I watched him more closely than I ever had before. I noticed the way his eyes would flicker toward the guard whenever I asked a question that hit too close to his past. I noticed how he would masterfully steer the conversation back to me, showering me with praise and plans for our future the second I mentioned the word transparency. It was a redirection tactic I had once called devotion, but now it felt like a magician's sleight of hand. I started to pay attention to the silence between his sentences. He would get this cold, distant look, a shudder falling over his expression whenever I brought up his legal case or the specifics of his parole hearing. He'd say he didn't want to bring that darkness into our light, but for the first time, I wondered if the darkness was all there actually was. The phone in the visiting room began to feel heavy, like it was made of lead. I found myself testing him, dropping small baiting comments just to see how he would react. I asked him if he ever thought about the people from his life before, and his entire posture shifted. His shoulders, usually relaxed and inviting, squared off. His grip on the receiver tightened until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He told me that there was no before, that his life hadn't truly started until the day he saw my name on an envelope. A year ago, that sentence would have made me cry with joy. Now, it made my skin crawl. It was too perfect. It was a line from a script that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. I began to realize that he never spoke about his childhood with any real detail, never mentioned friends or colleagues, never shared a memory that wasn't polished and sanitized for my consumption. Every time I reached for a piece of his history, he would offer me a compliment instead. It was a trade-off I had been willing to make for 3 years, my curiosity for his affection, but the trade was starting to feel like a scam. I was living for a man who was a blank slate, a person who had erased his own footsteps so I couldn't see where they led. The cracks weren't just in him, they were starting to spiderweb through my own life. I couldn't focus at work. I was constantly refreshing inmate locator databases and legal forums, looking for a thread to pull. I stopped seeing my friends because their "I told you so" looks felt like physical blows. I was becoming an island, and he was the only inhabitant. But the more I looked at him through the lens of that secret letter, the more I saw the micro-expressions he couldn't quite suppress. The flash of irritation when I pushed too hard, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes when he talked about our dream home, and the chillingly calm way he could lie about where he was during the facility's supposed blackout. I realized then that I wasn't just in love with a prisoner, I was in love with a vacuum. He had sucked up all my empathy, all my time, and all my faith, leaving nothing behind but the hollow echo of the man I thought he was. I knew I couldn't keep living in the maybe. I knew that if I didn't find the truth myself, the lies would eventually swallow me whole. There's a terrifying moment when you stop being a partner and start being a detective. It happened at 2 a.m., the blue light of my laptop screen the only thing illuminating my face in the dark apartment. I had always avoided the vulture websites, the ones that archive every grisly detail of a crime, because I thought it was a betrayal of our trust. I thought I was better than the people who judged him without knowing his soul. But trust is a luxury for the certain, and I was starving for certainty. I typed his full name into a specialized legal database I had paid $50 to access. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, a rhythmic thud, thud, thud that seemed to warn me to close the tab and go to sleep. But I pressed enter. At first, the results were what I expected. The robbery charge he had told me about, the one from 6 years ago. But as I scrolled down past the surface-level reports, I found a secondary file, a case from a different county, one he had never mentioned, a case that had been consolidated. My breath hitched. The words on the screen didn't make sense at first. Kidnapping, aggravated assault, terroristic threats. I blinked, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something less monstrous. I clicked on the court transcripts, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the desk. This wasn't a wrong place, wrong time robbery. This wasn't a man driven to a desperate act by poverty or bad luck. This was a calculated, violent abduction of a woman he had been obsessed with years ago. I read the victim's statement, the way he had followed her, the way he had cornered her, the way he had kept her in a basement for 48 hours while he explained why they were meant to be together. The language in the police report was sickeningly familiar. He had used the same phrases with her that he used with me. "You're the only one who sees the real me. The world doesn't understand our connection. I would do anything to keep you." I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean back and close my eyes. He hadn't been in prison for a property crime. He was in prison for a crime against a woman's soul. And the most haunting part? The dates. He had been writing to me, telling me I was his first and only true love, while he was still embroiled in the legal fallout of what he had done to her. He had used the outreach program not to reform, but to find a new audience. I looked at the photos of the evidence, the zip ties, the duct tape, and then I looked at the stack of letters on my nightstand. The handwriting was the same. The gentle, thoughtful man who wrote me poetry about the moon was the same man who had terrified a woman into a permanent state of trauma. I realized with a bone-chilling clarity that I wasn't his anchor. I was his next project. I was the person he was grooming to be his after, the one who would provide the alibi of a changed man once he finally walked out of those gates. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there in the dark, watching the cursor blink on the screen, realizing that I had been sleeping with a monster's words under my pillow for 3 years. Walking into the prison for the final time felt like walking into my own funeral. The air in the intake center was colder than I remembered, or perhaps it was just the ice that had settled in my marrow. I went through the motions, the metal detector, the stamped hand, the heavy thud of the magnetic locks, but I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I wasn't wearing the soft, approachable colors I usually chose for him. I was wearing black, a mourning shroud for the woman I had been only 48 hours ago. When I sat down at that familiar station, I didn't pick up the phone immediately. I just stared at the empty stool on the other side of the glass. When he finally walked through the door, he had that practiced, boyish smile on his face, the one that used to make my heart skip a beat. He picked up his receiver, leaning in close as if he were about to share a secret, his eyes searching mine for the usual adoration. But when he saw the expression on my face, the smile didn't fade. It curdled. It was like watching a mask lose its grip. I didn't say hello. I didn't ask how his week was. I simply pulled the folded printouts of the news articles and the court records from my bag and pressed them flat against the plexiglass, right where his hand usually rested. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I watched his eyes scan the bold black ink, the words kidnapping and aggravated assault screaming off the page. I waited for the denial. I waited for him to tell me it was a mistake, a relative with the same name, or a conspiracy by a bitter ex-girlfriend. I was still in some dark, desperate corner of my soul, begging him to lie to me one last time just so I wouldn't have to face the truth. But the man who looked back at me wasn't the gentle, misunderstood soul from the letters. His face went completely slack, then hardened into something sharp and predatory. His eyes, which I had once called liquid and warm, turned into 2 flat black stones. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look ashamed. He just let out a short, dry laugh that sent a tremor of pure terror through my chest. "I didn't tell you," he said, his voice dropping into a chillingly calm, melodic tone, "because you wouldn't have stayed, and I needed you to stay." It wasn't an apology. It was a confession of utility. I wasn't a partner, I was a resource. I was the character witness he needed for his parole board, the bank account he used for commissary, and the emotional punching bag he used to pass the time. The man I loved had never existed. He was just a collection of traits he had stolen from books and movies to mirror exactly what I wanted to see. The letter I had found in the book, the one about the woman who came into the picture, lay on the metal table between us. I tapped my finger on it, my voice trembling for the first time. "And who is she?" I asked, though I already knew the answer in my gut. He looked at the letter with a flick of his eyes, dismissive and bored. He explained, with a terrifying lack of empathy, that she was the one who understood the darkness, a woman from his past who didn't need the fairy tale I required. It hit me then that he had been playing 2 different games at the same time. With me, he was the tragic hero seeking redemption. With her, he was the unrepentant outlaw who missed the glory days of their shared chaos. I was the after, the polished, respectable life he wanted to pivot into, while she was the before he couldn't quite let go of. I realized that his heart wasn't a prize to be won. It was a revolving door. He didn't love me for who I was. He loved the way I reflected a version of himself that made him feel powerful. To him, women weren't people with feelings and fears. We were just chapters in a book he was writing to keep himself entertained in a cage. I looked at him and saw, for the first time, the calculation in every move he made. The way he tilted his head to look vulnerable, the way he lowered his voice to sound intimate. It was all a technique. He had spent years studying me, learning my triggers, and feeding me exactly the kind of honesty he knew I would swallow. The other woman wasn't my rival. She was my sister in a different kind of tragedy. She was the one who saw the monster and stayed, while I was the one who was meant to be fooled by the mask. As he sat there trying to pivot back into a rational explanation for why he had lied, I felt a wave of profound exhaustion. I didn't want to know her name. I didn't want to know their history. I just wanted to stop being part of the narrative. I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't the kidnapping or the assault. It was the fact that he had looked me in the eye for 3 years and seen nothing but a tool for his own survival. I was a means to an end, and now that the end had arrived, I was nothing more than a used-up page in a story he was ready to burn. The moment I stood up from that chair, the world seemed to shift from color into high-contrast black and white. Every memory I had of our love began to rewrite itself in a real time. The letters I had saved in a silk-lined box, they weren't love notes. They were blueprints for a cage he was building around my mind. The hours I spent driving through the night to see him, they weren't romantic sacrifices. They were errands I was running for a ghost. The future we had planned, the house with the porch, the quiet mornings, the life of restitution, collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. I realized that I hadn't been in a relationship. I had been in a cult of one. I had been the high priestess of a religion dedicated to a man who didn't exist. The man I knew was a composite sketch, a phantom I had helped him conjure out of my own loneliness and my own desire to be a good person. I felt a sudden, sharp grief for the woman I used to be, the one who believed that love could fix anything. She was gone, killed by the truth on a computer screen in the middle of the night. As I walked toward the exit, his voice followed me through the receiver he hadn't put down yet, a low, hissing stream of words that had shifted from "I love you" to "You'll never find anyone who understands you like I do." It was the final move in the manipulator's handbook, the attempt to make me fear the world without him. But as the heavy steel doors buzzed to let me out, I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange, hollow lightness. I walked past the other women in the waiting room, the ones still holding their care packages, still wearing their visiting day smiles, still believing the stories they were being told, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them to look in the books, to check the records, to stop being the after to a monster's before. But I knew they wouldn't listen. I hadn't listened. You don't leave until the illusion shatters so completely that the pieces can't be glued back together. I walked out into the parking lot, the sun hitting my face for the first time in what felt like decades, and I realized that the bars weren't the only thing that had been keeping us apart. The truth was a wall I could never climb, and for the first time in 3 years, I was glad it was there. Leaving didn't feel like a movie. There were no screeching tires, no dramatic music, no final, clever parting shot. It was just a quiet, deliberate walk to my car and the sound of my own breathing. I drove for 2 hours before I realized I didn't have a destination. I just needed to be moving away from that building, away from that man, and away from the person I had become while trying to save him. I stopped at a gas station and took every letter, every photo, and every care package list I had in my trunk and threw them into a dumpster behind the building. It felt like shedding a second skin that had been suffocating me. I realized that the tragedy of the last 3 years wasn't what he had done to me, but what I had done to myself. I had traded my reality for fantasy, and in doing so, I had nearly lost my ability to see the world as it truly is. But as I drove, the anger began to subside, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't a victim. I was a survivor of my own empathy. I had learned that loyalty is a virtue, but loyalty to a lie is a prison of its own making. I had learned that you can love someone with every fiber of your being and still not know them at all. And most importantly, I learned that the only person who could truly set me free wasn't a judge or parole board. It was me. I was the one holding the keys to my own life all along. I had just been too busy trying to unlock his cell to notice. The road ahead looked long and lonely, but for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't driving toward a visitation room. I was driving toward myself. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter with me today. This story is a reminder that the people we love are often mirrors of what we want to see, rather than windows into who they truly are. If this story touched you, or if it felt a little too close to home, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. We are building a community here at Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, where we face the uncomfortable truths together. So please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought. Loyalty is a beautiful thing, but it should never be a blindfold. You deserve a love that stands in the light, not one that hides in the shadows of a secret past. Until next then, keep your eyes open and your heart guarded. We'll see you in the next episode.